Okay, so welcome everyone, whether you're at HNC or in Washington or Bologna or scattered around the world. This is one of our series of HNC Friday lectures on a variety of topics. And we're very happy today to have a graduate of HNC from the class of 2010-2011, Laure Pallez. She actually took my globalization class when I was teaching that a number of years ago at HNC. She has quite an international background. She's lived outside France for the last 2 decades, 10 years of which was spent in China. She included 5 years at the Pasteur Institute of Shanghai, a Sino-French center in the biological research field, where she represented the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And since leaving China, she's been living in the United States and has worked in the past for the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. as an economic advisor. She's also an elected representative of French citizens in Florida and was previously a representative of French citizens in Shanghai. So she's been doing this both in the United States and in China. She was also a candidate for the French Senate in 2021. And today she's going to be talking about the French presidential election campaign candidates and what to expect. The presidential election, the first round, will be held on April 10th of this year, and then with a runoff most likely in the second round on April 24th, 2022. So Laure brings a unique perspective from across the world and the French overseas community to this important political topic. So I'll turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Adam. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Hello from Washington, D.C. It's 9 a.m. Today, Friday. I'm happy to be here with you today. I have to tell you that I wrote extensively about the US elections back in 2020 for my fellows in France, trying to understand the coalition of the left behind President Biden. And learning from the US politics made me grow a lot to serve my country and my people. Today, my views are strictly personal and I don't represent anybody but myself. So today is the deadline for the publication of the official list of candidates for the presidential election in France. So what a great timing to discuss this issue. As Adam mentioned, my personal interest is on overseas French. They're numbering about 3 million people. That is about 5% of the total population of France. So imagine that 17 million Americans living outside of the USA. France is one of the only country in the world who has representatives dedicated to expats in the government. Overseas French are often very patriotic, often nostalgic of their motherland, and see France's ranking and position in the world as a key issue for them. I proudly represent the French citizens living in Florida, and as mentioned by Adam, was also involved in a national political campaign for the French Senate last year. It was a very rough one that taught me politics in a hard way. In Florida, I campaign on a progressive agenda and a climate change program. French overseas are traditionally 2/3 conservative, 1/3 liberal. Main concerns of French citizens are pensions, taxes, and education for their children, like many of us. I define myself as an internationalist at heart, but not necessarily a globalist though. I believe the same forces create the same consequences in Western democracies. And in my view, there's a lot in common between the Yellow Vest movement in France, was a popular uprising movement against growing gas prices in France, the flyover state voters in the United States, and the Canadian trucking protest more recently. I have to say that I'm very concerned about this situation that impacts middle-class population and voters. And I've focused a lot of my papers and my political fights over that matter. Sorry to be so long on this introduction, but I thought it would be a good a way to start and to tell you what I care about in politics. That said, I propose to give you a bit of an institutional background on French elections, the 2022 who's who, the political climate back home, domestic and international issues in this campaign, ending up with a wrap up and probably risky projections, but I'm still going to do that. So in a few words, let me give you a little bit of a context about this election. So the incumbent president of France, Emmanuel Macron, everybody knew he was ready to run for re-election, and he declared his re-election bid yesterday in a letter published in local newspapers in France. In 2017, candidate Macron started a new platform outside of mainstream parties, and he was very successful. The former president, François Hollande, did not believe that could work, having always been supported by traditional parties. Macron created a centrist political party called En Marche, with the attempt to create parties that can cross partisan lines. Speaking on why he formed this platform, he said there is a real divide in France between conservatives and progressives. I think somehow En Marche, his movement is similar to Andrew Yang's platform, the Forward Party, and I would be happy in the discussion section to have your opinion on that, to see how you see this new platform outside of GOP and the Democratic Party in the US. Anyhow, on April 23rd, 2017, Macron received the most votes in the first round of the presidential elections, with 24% of the overall vote, 8 million votes together. He progressed to the second round and was elected president of France with 66% of the vote, but the election has a record abstention at 25%, and 8% of ballots were blank or spoiled. So this slide seems a little bit heavy, but I'm still going to show it to you. This is public information. In his first few months as president, Emmanuel Macron enacted a package of reforms. My previous job was to tell those reforms about to American investors interested in investing in France. So I know this really by heart. He had reforms on public ethics, labor laws, taxes. One of his first measures was to remove a very symbolic wealth tax. And after that, he became the president of the rich and carries this image along. His 5-year term has been marked by a lot of social issues, strikes against his pension reform to work a longer period that did not go through, bottom-up yellow vest protests that I mentioned before, citizen-driven movement against the digital COVID pass, and he encountered as well a lot of international tensions and crises. I'm thinking of Lebanon, Mali, and more recently, Ukraine, of course. He's a very pro-European president. He defends European sovereignty and European defense. Let me go back a little bit on the who and how is elected the president of France. So the president of France is officially the president of the French Republic, head of state, as well as the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces. Is elected for a 5-year term, previously was a 7-year period, and is directly elected by the citizens. France adopted a new constitution in 1958 that split powers between the president as the head of state and the prime minister as the head of government. Or in short, France has both a president and a prime minister. Charles de Gaulle was the first president elected under this new constitution in 1965, believed in the strong head of state, which he described as the spirit of the nation. So currently the president cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. So Emmanuel Macron is re-eligible for re-election for a second 5-year term, according to the Constitution of France. So what are the rules to be eligible? In order to be admitted as an official candidate, potential ones must receive signed nominations, also known as sponsors, from more than 500 local officials, mainly mayors, and there are about 45,000 elected officials in France and overseas, including 33,000 mayors. To become president of France, candidates must receive a greater than 50% of the votes. If not, there will be a second round and a runoff election will be held between the two top candidates. This election will be held just before the 2022 legislative elections to elect the member of the chamber to make a comparison with the US Congress. So who's who in this election? Like I said, so today, March 4th, is the last day to obtain the 500 endorsements. And 11 candidates have qualified to run. You see the number of candidates, the number of sponsors, the total number does not appear, but it's about 1,500 for the top ones. So then you go, you go down like that. So in my opinion, only 4 candidates are on the campaign trail since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. We'll come back to that in the international part later, but to me, so I'm going to focus on 7 of them, but only 4 are really, I mean, still, you know, in the race, I would say. The conservative Valérie Pécresse, far-right Éric Zemmour, centrist left Anne Hidalgo, and far-left Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So let me get into a little bit more details on who's who, starting from the far left to the far right. So the oldest candidate of the 2022 presidential election is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is the far left candidate. He joined a minor Trotskyist movement in his youth, is a vocal critic of centrism and a Eurosceptic. He ran in 2017 with his party called the Rebellious France. He became one of the fiercest opponents to the new president, Emmanuel Macron. His voters are young and urban. He claims to gather the left behind his name and is very radical. Then comes Anne Hidalgo, the socialist candidate. So just to be aware, the Socialist Party in France is a center-left social democratic political party that holds pro-European views. I personally joined this party 12 years ago, and I wonder what I was thinking. Anne Hidalgo has been serving as mayor of Paris since 2014. She's the first woman to hold that office. She has strong proposals, but gathers only a small minority of voters at this point who are either not rallying Emmanuel Macron or the far left. An interesting character also is Yannick Jadot, is the Green candidate. He started his career as an activist for various NGOs like Greenpeace. He's a member elected of the European Parliament right now, and he won his party primary against a very radical lady who imposed a more radical agenda, and his campaign is mainly aiming at an environment and energy based voters. He gathers a small number of intentions at this point. Emmanuel Macron is the center candidate. I already talked a bit about him before. He claims he's both on the right and on the left. He has several right-wing ministers. He defends the colors of Europe. His polls are stable at 24%, but this number might increase with the Ukraine war, even if he sometimes appears very detached from people's lives. Valérie Pécresse is the mainstream or conservative candidate from the right. She comes from top business schools, top public school administration. She served under Nicolas Sarkozy and under Jacques Chirac as well. She's an elected president of the Greater Paris Metropolitan Region. Her credo is liberté, liberté chérie, freedom, beloved freedom. She's trying to focus less on national identity and more on freedom. She knows there is a reservoir of votes on the far right voters, but her campaign is not developing as good as she expected for many reasons. Then comes Marine Le Pen. She's a very famous, it's her third race for this election. Her father was created the National Front in 1972, a pro-colonialist Christian party known for his taste of provocation. She's more mainstream. She has a softer message toward blue-collar, rural France, less educated voters, with a very traditional platform against immigration, NATO, and the EU. To me, she stands in the very straightforward populist camp. Voters who follow her claim they were abandoned by the left. This is probably her last race. She made it to the second round twice already in the past elections. Then comes Éric Zemmour. Éric Zemmour was a prominent columnist, a TV pundit, a successful writer known for his taste of provocation as well. He was 3 times convicted for hate speech. He denounces France's decline, partially due to the influence of Islam, and defends the nationalist theory of the great replacement of French natives by immigrants. He decided to run for the 2022 election in December and created his own political movement called the Reconquest. He's a populist candidate. He's not anti-intellectuals or anti-technocrats. He appeals to history and ideas, not just politics of the guts. He flirts with declinist theory, like I said, of the French civilization, thinking Muslim culture will replace the Christian culture, fear of imported US culture, and so on. His goal, he claims, is to rebuild a right-wing program. I believe his voters are orphans of the National Front of Marine Le Pen's electors. Figures of the mainstream right have already endorsed him, so there's a high probability for him to be in the second round. There's a very interesting comparison between Trump and Zemmour that Donald Trump and Éric Zemmour that I would like to tell you about. People say in France we are under Americanization of the French politics, Fox News, CNews. It's true that Éric Zemmour took a phone call with Donald Trump recently, as well as with Viktor Orban, and his theories echoes to Trump's crippled America. Zemmour has written many books on France's decline in the past. However, Donald Trump had the support of a strong party back then. Zemmour is not in this position, but Emmanuel Macron was not either in 2017. So I believe he could very well defeat Marine Le Pen and Valérie Pécresse, far right and conservative right candidates. But the second round, it will probably face a cliff. So as you can see, there's a large choice of candidates, very different from elections in the US. It's an interesting time for us. A little bit maybe about the campaign funding that is also very different from the United States. So spending and financing of campaigns in France and political parties are highly regulated. There is a cap of on spending at 17 million euros, and government public financing or 50% of spending in the candidate if the candidate scores more than 5%. The biggest spenders usually win. Emmanuel Macron beat Marine Le Pen in the second round in 2017 election after outspending her by more than 4 million euros. Private financing is strictly regulated. Individuals cannot loan money to presidential candidates, but can make donations up to 4,500 euros. Those who break the rules face heavy penalties. All right, now let's go back into more details about what it has stake in this campaign, domestic and agenda, and the foreign, in terms of foreign policy as well. So, sorry, this is in French on the left, but I try to translate some part of it. So at home, I would say that on the domestic front, the top three concerns are purchasing power with rising price of gas and electricity, health system, and somehow climate change. Youth is to vote on energy and climate. National identity is also very much at stake in this campaign. You may remember the terrible Charlie Hebdo's attack in 2015 in Paris. That was a turning point for my country. Freedom of speech, defense of separation of church and state are very important and points of disagreement with the US. We spoke a lot about that. I remember back at HNC in 2010 with you, Adam, and that stick with me since then. Knowing that these topics are so important for people, you would expect leftist candidates to rally more people on these issues. But there is a disconnect between concerns and who can do something on the ground. Like in the US, what the people are the most concerned about and what the media and politicians talk about don't match. Similar to the US, that creates mistrust of the media and a very fertile background for populist movements. So let's now move to the international section of my talk before the discussion part. So with Ukraine, of course, foreign policy is at the heart of the campaign in the midst of an unprepared Europe. A little bit of background of transatlantic relations. Jacques Chirac, president from 1995 to 2007, was the last president to be non-aligned with the USA. Since him, French presidents Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, Emmanuel Macron are in favor of alignment with old allies. Last year, French-US relations were quite tense under the submarine crisis due to the fallout of the AUKUS security pact between the US, UK, and Australia. To the point that France recalled its ambassadors from Australia and the US for consultations. Despite tensions in the past, that had never happened before. But after a call between Emmanuel Macron and President Joe Biden, the two leaders agreed to reduce bilateral tensions, and exchanges are still permanent at this point. Coming back on the campaign trail, the candidates are split, as you can see from the slide, on their response to Putin and the crisis, and not along left-right traditional lines. What is true for Ukraine is also true for Mali, with the withdrawing of the French troops promoted by the leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-right Marine Le Pen, and on the other side, those advocated to remain, such as Yannick Jadot, the Green candidate, or Valérie Pécresse, the conservative right candidate. A few words on Ukraine. As you know, that evolves very fast. The speed of which European members agreed on new sanctions against Russia is also a historic breakthrough that makes the candidates' programs look old. The Eurosceptic leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon, far-right candidates Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour still oppose further European integration, while the reality demands a stronger Europe. They also continue to plead for the exit of France from NATO, denouncing American imperialism. I worry days ahead may be worse. Emmanuel Macron said yesterday, I will defend a strategy of European energy independence because we can no longer depend on others. and in particular on Russian gas, he said. So, in short, the political dividing line over Russia, as over so many French foreign policy debates, Europe, NATO, Mali, China, is between center, globalist, European parties on one side, united with the US and the EU in support of deterrence against Russia, for instance. And on the other side, on the extreme, both extremes, more so-called sovereignist candidates who are ready to blame the US, but at the same time are also against military escalation. So maybe more internationalist in that way. Anyhow, on April 24th, on the second round day of the election, in the evening, the new president will probably have to deal with this crisis and maybe a humanitarian emergency. I'm going to wrap up and give you a little bit of a forecast for this election before taking questions and discussions. With Ukraine, the presidential campaign is taking a back seat. There is no passion. There was no passion before Ukraine anyway, but there's no crystallization on any topic, unfortunately. I would have liked to see candidates discuss housing crisis, poverty, public services, reindustrialization of France, and so on. The country's presidential elections in April will also have a EU-wide consequences. Like I said, lack of participation, abstention, lack of public engagement is a big concern. I think protesters on social issues are angry and did not rally to a candidate. So Emmanuel Macron is ahead today, or I should say was stable in the polls until now at 24%. If the first round happened today, 30% of vote would be in his favor. Marine Le Pen would get 14.5%, and Éric Zemmour, so the two far-right candidates, Éric Zemmour would get 13%. That's according to the latest polls this morning. So Emmanuel Macron has a commanding lead in the votes. One has to go back to the 1965 presidential election to find such a gap between two candidates. Back then, Charles de Gaulle defeated François Mitterrand, who then became president years later for a term of 14 years. But back then in 1965, half of the French population was not even born. So we'll see. Like I said, Éric Zemmour could be in the second round, could defeat Marine Le Pen and Valérie Pécresse, but in the second round, we probably face a cliff. Thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested in this topic, there is a very good daily review from Le Monde, the newspaper, a French newspaper. It's called The French Test. It's in English and it's very, very nice. You can also visit my blog, my personal blog. It's mainly in French, but I try to write in English now. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a quite comprehensive overview. So we can open up for questions and discussion. If you want to put your hand up to ask a question and turn on your camera, you're welcome to do that. You can also type a question in the chat if you prefer that too. I think while people are thinking of questions or comments they might want to make, I guess we can start, given your sort of HNC and SAIS background. I was wondering if you could say a little about, how HNC has fitted into your trajectory, like how you came to HNC and how your time in China has influenced how you think about these things in the, I guess, 10 or 11 years since you left HNC.
Thank you. So HNC was a highlight in my studies and also in my life, I should say. I did not. I was in China for personal reasons. I was studying Chinese at Nanjing Daishui, an engineering university, and I came into across this program. My long-term goal was also at one point to be working in the United States. I'm very interested in globalization for many reasons. My kids are binationals and so on. So to me, it was very natural choice to study at HNC. I learned a lot about, I mean, not only American perspectives on things that I knew, but also the Chinese way of thinking from a more theoretical way. I remember in your course, Adam, we discussed a lot about non-alignment, about you know, the G2 issues, and as a European back then, I felt very a little bit left out. I think the only few of us, probably you know, from Mexico, Italy, and France, we were a minority, and that was to me such an interesting perspective as an outsider to see how China and the US interacted by then. Coming back to the States, I was, going to the States, I was very surprised about the tensions. I mean, not surprised, but I realized how the tensions escalated between the two countries, diplomatic tensions. And I always thought there is a better way to do things. So yes, I don't know if that answers your questions, but.
Okay, sure. I guess we could ask a question here which relates to sort of France and American China as well. I mean, obviously, you know, France sort of being, you know, embedded within the European Union, also a, you know, major power itself, but, you know, smaller in scale than the US and China or the EU as a whole. How do you see the sort of positioning of French foreign policy, or the sources of influence that France has in terms of these kinds of global issues? I mean, when someone is elected as president of France today, for example, compared to, say, 20 years ago or 50 years ago, how would you say they see the global landscape and France's ability to influence these kinds of global issues?
I mean, France has always been on the first, ahead of, not ahead, but has been positioned itself as a very influential country for as far as foreign policy is concerned. For many reasons, we have we're part of the UN Security Council. We have, I hope, a big diplomatic voice in our foreign policy. I'm not sure how things changed. What I observed is that, like I said, our presidents are way more or Atlantist or pro, you know, America than they were before. So, is there a strong voice? Yes. Is there a strong European voice? They probably hope so. But the truth is, there's a lot of alignment also with the United States. So. I mean, I see we still have a voice, and yeah, I don't know what to tell you more.
Oh, sure. I see we have our first question in the chat here from Roger Rafa, who I don't think was at HNC when we were there, but he teaches energy resources and environment. And he says, you mentioned that 2 of the 3 major concerns are about energy, and France has a very strong reliance on nuclear energy. Do the candidates have different positions about that going forward?
Yes, they do have different positions. There are some candidates on the left side are very anti-nuclear energy. That's been a big debate on the left. But most centrist candidates are in favor of nuclear energy and reliance on nuclear energy. The truth is, over the past 5 years, we have closed some nuclear plants in France. So there is, you know, this big debate over nuclear energy. What should we do? Should we continue with that? Should we? And with the Ukraine crisis and dependence on Russia, especially, I mean, this is more true for Germany than France, but there is a high reliance on German gas at this point. Sorry, on Russian gas. So this is also, that comes up in the debate, of course, and there's a discussion around that, but I can answer you more in details if you would like in writing later, if you want more details on the programs of each candidate on that issue.
One thing that I think people have noticed over the last year or two is that, I mean, America's so-called pivot to Asia with Obama happened, I guess, a decade or so ago starting. And it seems that in the last couple of years, Europe seems to be paying more attention to Asia, particularly to East Asia and to the rise of China. Would you say that China is getting more attention in French politics and French foreign policy? Is this something which is more on the radar screen than it was?
Yes, I think definitely. You have to remember there are very strong economic ties between China and France. We had official bilateral relations since 1964. There's a lot of exchanges in different fields, public health, automotives, I mean, so many fields. I think there are about 20,000 companies or subsidiaries, French subsidiaries, investing or having, still a presence in China now. So that's the relationship is obviously very important on the economic front, at least. Tensions for the last 2 years, like the ones, I guess, between the US and China, came from the Xinjiang crisis, or the Xinjiang situation. A lot has been said about the Uyghurs in French politics by a member of European Parliament in particular. So this has been a strong advocacy in the public debate, with French people feeling very anti-China for that reason. And on a more economic front, and I've seen that in Washington a lot, there's a lot being said about IP, the IP situation, the intellectual property situation in China. How do we keep our interests safe, and so on. So these are the two topics that that echo a lot on both sides of the Atlantic, in my opinion, Xinjiang and IP. So yes, there is tension, but I don't think, and I know our diplomacy is not going to put an end with any, Chinese relations at this point, because China is such an important partner for France.
I notice in a lot of countries, you talked about this polarization between a kind of globalist or center-left bloc and the kind of a populist or more right-wing bloc. And it seems in many countries in the West, the more populist bloc has been somewhat more sympathetic to Russia and somewhat more critical of China, whereas the globalist bloc has been somewhat more critical of Russia and, if not sympathetic to China, at least more eager to cooperate with China on certain issues. Would you say that in France that landscape lines up that way or not? That the right is more pro-Russia, anti-China on the left, or the globalists are more pro-China, anti-Russia?
I think that the same trends are can be observed in France. It's very interesting. Yes, there is a line that is a little bit different on China and Russia for historic reasons, and pragmatic reasons of the right with China, economic reasons, and probably ideological reasons behind China's feeling, the feeling towards Russia. So yes, about the same line, I would say, in France. I see there is a question in the chat, but maybe you want to.
Yeah, actually, since this is actually on France and China, so it's mentioned the former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin from 2002 to 2005 has been one of the first advocates of strengthening relations between France and China. I don't know what the question was getting at there, but did you have more you wanted to say about that example?
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you mentioned, I worked with a research institute in China, in Shanghai, the Pasteur Institute, and Jean-Pierre Raffarin was the one who created that partnership in 2004. 2004 was a year of strengthening the links between China and France under the presidency of Jacques Chirac, who was a very pro-China president. So it's true that Jean-Pierre Raffarin has been very influential on Chinese politics in France. And he advocates, you're right, to strengthen the relationship between the two countries. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But with COVID, things have changed a little bit as well. Yeah. I didn't mention COVID.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I see Joe Renoir has his hand up. He's a professor of history and American studies at HNC and also has done quite a bit of work on transatlantic relations. Joe, do you want to pose a question?
Yes. Yeah, thanks so much, Ms. Pallez, for your presentation. I fear I'm saying your name wrong. But
it's okay.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about security and especially NATO. I know the war is only now 8 or 9 days on, but we're reading so much about Germany and how this is a game-changing moment for Germany, that it's a bit of a watershed moment. And I wonder if there's the same sense of urgency in France. Do you see that there is a feeling that this is a new era for Europe and a new era for the approach to NATO and to not just European, but transatlantic security? I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on security, so I don't want to say things that I don't, totally can talk about. But my sense is that the Ukraine war and the Russian invasion has given a lot of reasons for European country members to strengthen their answers response to this threat with NATO, and that gives a sense of for what NATO is for. And it's almost like this conflict has given a reason or maybe a boost in European defense and NATO. It's hard to differentiate both. Concretely speaking, that's a question I'm actually returning back to you. How do you see this European defense? I would like to hear you about that too. In a word, yes, I think the answer is this crisis has escalated the NATO response and willingness to have a stronger organization at this point between EU members and European defense. But I'd like to hear you back on the how do you see this all can be linked together in a more precise way.
I think somebody made the comment yesterday that I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine had done more for European military, unity and cooperation in 3 days than in the previous 30 years. But Joe, I don't know whether you had a follow-up comment about this.
Well, I have nothing to add that we've not already heard. There's so much great commentary out there. But it struck me as you were speaking that French domestic politics, it only comes into our radar in America, I think, on occasions like elections. And we just heard so much this week about Germany. And of course, we know that there was a lot of debate over NATO funding and over conceptual issues during Trump's presidency. And I think in the 1 year or so that Biden has been president, NATO has been kind of on the side, on the back burner, saying, well, we know that there's a better relationship. And as Dr. Webb has said, this is the coalescing act, that the invasion of Ukraine seems to be pulling together a lot of the threads that were potentially there. But I don't have any great insight. I just thought this is a great opportunity for us to learn more about French domestic politics. And I'd be very curious to see how this works, especially after the election, and how whether this is as much a sense of urgency as we see in Germany. In fact, I'd be curious to see if that's lasting, if what appears to be a sense of urgency is really lasting in Germany as well. But I'm I'm afraid I have no great insight beyond what we've heard. There's so much great commentary these days, but I really appreciate your talk. This is a very great insight into domestic politics. So thanks again.
Thank you.
I think Roger Alpha looks as if he's about to make a question or comment.
Yeah, I was just, it's interesting because when you're talking with, this idea that that Macron has really been very active in trying to negotiate ahead of this. And I was very curious as to whether, you've had some sort of feeling in the past that he was a little more pro-Russian than some of the other aspects or some of the other politicians in Europe. Has this hurt Macron in any way, or is he seen more of a statesman? I've just been wondering how this affects his political posture.
Oh, I think that helps him in a great way. It was unexpected, but it's definitely helping him to put himself as a very strong head of state. His Russian position was it was not entire Russia, but this invasion creates momentum, and France is, of course, at the heart of the. I mean, it's about Kyiv is 1,000 kilometers away from Paris, so this is really pressing people's lives.
Right.
So yes, that's I see it as a turning point in this campaign, which I mentioned before had no passion. Yeah.
That'll help them. Okay.
Mm.
That's good.
Okay, any other questions? I think you mentioned briefly towards the end of your talk, most of the French population was born after, I think you mentioned 1965. I was wondering if you could say a little more about some of the generational sort of differences or fault lines on this political landscape, maybe in terms of the base of these different candidates, or more sort of longer term or deeper trends in terms of generational support patterns.
You mean the current candidates, or you mean?
Well, yeah,
the
current candidates, but also just in terms of the general trend lines as far as generational political views.
So since 1965, you had a very how can I say, two parties, succession of events, the right, the left, the right, the left, and then comes Emmanuel Macron 5 years ago with this centrist platform claiming no right, no left. And it's very disturbing for our old politicians back home, because I spoke with a number of them and they don't really understand what's going on. They did not expect the success of such outside of mainstream parties. I mean, this success, yes, and the question that both sides have today is how to rebuild a positive agenda. What is the left today? What is the right also today? Extremes are way more heard than centrists, except Emmanuel Macron. And Emmanuel Macron is really gathering a lot of voters on both sides. So that's a new shift. That's a new shift that's very untraditional compared to what we've seen in the past over 50 years. And my personal concern and my views are that there's a space at the left side of the politics stage that hasn't been filled. And I don't think, like I said, I don't think, given all the concerns of the people, I don't see, or I don't understand why there's such a disconnect between the offer and what people would have to say, or their daily concerns. So how things going to evolve, I don't know. there is probably a need also for renewal of politicians with a more global view. We've said that for the last 10 years or so, but I think this is really urgent. And yes, that's about what I have to say on that point.
In several Western countries, I think there's a growing perception that the post-war consensus on certain values or social model and things that most people would have in common seems to have weakened or maybe even unraveled. But a lot of this polarization is because there is less agreement on certain fundamental assumptions. I think one of the sort of characteristics of modern French political culture is this kind of civic consensus on the Republic and laïcité and so on. I was wondering to what extent you think that sort of core consensus is still intact, or is there a kind of an unraveling or a polarization where many people don't actually agree on fundamental things the way they would have 50 years ago?
There is, I mean, this big turning point that I mentioned, the Charlie Hebdo events in 2015, that really was, attacking really people's heart and feelings towards this the separation between church and the state and so on. So that's, even though that's part of our core values, that has affected us in a deep way. And some people have changed. I mean, people became more extreme on national identity, this, Christianity, separation of church and so on, because they felt hurt. And so that's, to me, that was a very important point. And at the same time, there is an Americanization of the French politics, and what I see in the US with all the identity politics taking such a great importance in the US has been imported in France. This is a very, very prominent and important, discussion that people have. This is not in our culture, but this is becoming an important topic of discussion and also of differentiation between the candidates programs today. And yes, I would be happy also to hear you about what you think of how identity politics can influence politics today in the world.
Yeah. And I think that there's another dimension of this, which is the role that the European Union, or at least the idea of the European Union, or the idea of being European, plays in many people's imagination. I mean, in the UK, we've seen this with Brexit, this kind of projection onto being part of the European Union or being European versus being British in some sense, and this kind of fault line represents something deeper in divisions in political culture. How would you say membership of the European Union or being part of this broader European space is affecting this sense of a common identity, or matters more to some people than to others? Is this filling some of the gap, maybe for some part of the population?
No, you're totally right. I should have maybe started with that instead of jumping into identity politics, but that's to me, that's also very important. There is a disconnect also and a very different view on what the EU should be for my French fellows. There are differences, of course, within the candidates' programs on what they propose. And you're right, Brexit had a very strong impact on French politics. Some people back in France said, yes, they're taking back, the British are taking back their destiny, and they now can decide for themselves. And this is what we want in France too. So there's a strong appeal to exiting what we call Frexit. to exit the EU for some promoted by some candidates who are not in the race, by the way, anymore. Marine Le Pen was in the past advocating for exiting the euro and so on, but she has a more mainstream speech about that as well right now, which makes her also decrease probably in the polls. So that's very important. And what can in general, what people see about Europe is that prices have risen. There's more immigration. That's what the Yellow Vests movement are claiming, and this is a threat to their lives. So how do you respond to that? Of course, Ukraine is giving us a chance to explain why Europe is important, a stronger Europe, but does that change people's lives? How do you deal with the future? I hope not too strong, but yet to come a humanitarian emergency that we are seeing already. These are all very important questions in the public debate in France at the moment.
Slightly different question. I mean, as a representative of the overseas community, and this being where I think a lot of your political activity and consciousness lies, what is it like engaging with the politics of a country from this kind of overseas perspective? And you mentioned France having this distinctive pattern of representatives of the French overseas community. I think you also mentioned that in the past, the majority of the French overseas community has been more conservative leaning. I wonder if you could say a little more about what the political landscape among the overseas community looks like, and what it's like to represent this sort of overseas group.
So it's been a very interesting experience. I started got into politics for overseas French back in 2013 in China, and people are they usually left for a long time. They're 40% of them are binationals, so worldwide. So that gives you an idea of they have concerns about what's going on at home, but they also very often acquired a double or third citizenship. So they're also involved in their host country, I should say. And so that makes a very interesting characters and figures. They're often, like I said, 2/3 very conservative. Some left for tax reasons, but some left for family reasons, some left for cultural reasons. But what I see is a very overall very strong interest towards others and other cultures. So this appeals a lot to me, and so that's been excited. France is very generous, is quite generous with its expats overseas. We have our government is helping us with scholarships. Many other during COVID, we had some also money flowing at us to keep flow, and yeah, it's quite unique to have this representation outside of France. Italy has the same system, and yeah, this has been a very interesting road.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned COVID just now, and I think for people living in a kind of overseas or transnational social space or way of life, one of the features of the pandemic has been this kind of resurgence of national borders or limits on movement and everything. I mean, how would you say that's been viewed or experienced by the French overseas community?
Oh, that's been tough. That's been very hard for many people. I know, especially in China or Hong Kong, or the whole region. has been, some people haven't seen their family back home for 3 years. The last trip home was Christmas 2019 for many of them. So there's a big difference between expats outside of the EU and expats within the EU, and that's why also the EU is so important to us, because you can during the pandemic you could within the EU it was much easier to move from a country to another despite a lot of restrictions, and so that's been a source of worry. A lot of people decided to end their career or their time outside of France if they could, because often it's not easy to go home in a week, or it takes people have companies, people have families, and so that's been affecting a lot of people's lives. So I would say mobility, access to the vaccine has been also a point of discussion. For those of us who live in countries like the USA, it was very easy to access vaccines, of course. In China, I don't know about your experience, but I heard this. I mean, you have to get the local vaccine. So the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs has, in countries where the vaccine was not easy to get, they were sent, exported some vaccines from the French territory. So that's also the kind of issues that people had. So mobility, access to treatment or vaccine, and loss of jobs very often. I mean, it's been a rough time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if there's any other question that anyone has, since we're a bit over an hour now, so we can probably wrap up at this point. But I want to thank you again for this very wide-ranging discussion of a whole lot of issues around French politics and international relations and the overseas experience. I think it adds a very useful perspective to the HNC and SAIS community, and the video is going up on the SAIS events YouTube site in a few days as well. So we'll have more people with the opportunity to view that. So we also hope you'll have the chance to come back and visit us at HNC once things get a bit more normal with travel. That would be good to have you.
I would love to.
Back. Yeah.
I would love to. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and look forward to seeing you at some point somewhere in the not too distant future.
Yes.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Okay. Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye.